I emphasize truth because Woodson lived in a world where there was a great deal of misinformation about African Americans. And while I know that we are familiar with this problem of misinformation today, the problem was far worse in Woodson's time. In 1912, when Woodson received his Ph.D. from Harvard, he was most likely assigned in one of his American history courses a book by a white professor, William A. Dunning. And Dunning wrote the book Reconstruction, Political and Economic. It was published in 1907. The book presented a very negative interpretation of the federal government's role to transform the South and the status of African Americans after the Civil War. According to Dunning, African Americans were not ready for self-government, and therefore they should not have been given the right to vote or rights of equal citizenship. Dunning's influential book enjoyed such a large and respected following that scholars referred to the Dunning School of Reconstruction history. In the early years when Dr. Woodson was getting ASALH off the ground, he confronted racist scholarship that went unquestioned in schoolrooms, books, in films, and the court. For example, the influential work of the white historian Ulrich Phillips at Columbia University, who wrote on the subject of slavery in his highly acclaimed book, American Negro Slavery. That was published in 1918. And this book was considered the authoritative text on slavery until the mid-1950s. Phillips argued that slavery was economically unprofitable, meaning slave masters didn't make any money off of slaves. He also, and this is even worse, he argued that slavery was basically good for black people since it was, and I'm quoting him, a training school for civilization. Woodson knew better. His own parents had been slaves. He believed that only rigorous research and the presentation of facts could put an end to such lies. And since racist scholarship was used to defend segregation and the denial of voting rights in the courts and in Congress and by presidents of the United States, Woodson emphasized that knowledge of the truth about black people would be crucial to our struggle for racial equality in America. He believed that knowledge of history had the power to transform our lives by transforming the mind and intellect of men and women and boys and girls. This was his battle for social justice. And it took tremendous fortitude to fight the systemic racism that removed African Americans by law. It was legal to segregate from public spaces, from the electorate, from constitutional guarantees. Woodson was up against no small challenge, given that the larger American culture, through its newspapers, art, film, literature, advertisements, and especially the narrative of history, shaped social thought. So to give you an example of the power of history in the film industry, ASALH was founded, as you know, in 1915. This is the very year that the movie Birth of a Nation comes out. The film enjoyed tremendous box office success. It was technologically forward-looking, but as far as its message, it was awful. It glorified the Ku Klux Klan and lynching, and in its profoundly hostile treatment of black office holders during Reconstruction, it gave a terrible historical image of African Americans. The film was considered historical fact by the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, who was a scholarly man. The film was shown in the White House by President Woodrow Wilson. It was shown at a private screening hosted by the National Press Club in DC. And among the illustrious guests in the audience was the Supreme Court's Chief Justice of the United States, the Secretary of the Navy, 38 US senators, some 50 members of the House of Representatives, and their wives. So it's not an exaggeration to say that the government, academia, the movie industry, and the media all seem to be in collusion in perpetuating the racist slogan, America is the white man's country. Now Woodson had an answer to this, however, and I quote him. If you teach the Negro that he has accomplished as much good as any other race, he will aspire to equality and justice without regard to race. Such an effort would upset the program of the oppressor. Now, those are the words of Carter G. Woodson. And so his African American History Project, the Black movement to which he devoted his life and about which Ph.D. Dagbovie has written so brilliantly, was never intended to be a high-brow, learned society that provided interesting factual information or satisfied intellectual curiosity. Nope. From the very beginning, Woodson envisioned ASALH as an organization that would lead the way in the production and promotion of knowledge through scholarly research, publishing, and teaching on subjects related to people of African descent for the purposes of building racial pride, heightening Black self-awareness, and nurturing self-confidence to fight the fight against racism. Now, Black history was to be our armor in that fight for racial justice and equality. And as head of ASALH, Woodson steered a decades-long course that would transform not only history, but the larger society. And this is why he worked with not only academics, but he worked with school teachers at the secondary school level. He worked with teachers' unions, as my Black teachers' unions, as my colleague Jarvis Givens has written about. And so it should not surprise you to learn that ASALH stood on the front lines of the Black freedom struggle in the 1920s and the 1930s, when the NAACP was fighting in the courts against housing segregation and voting rights, and when it waged valiant anti-lynching crusades. The NAACP would honor Carter G. Woodson by giving him its highest award, the Spingarn Medal, in 1926. And I'm happy to say that the Carter G. Woodson Home, National Historic Site in Washington, D.C., houses that Spingarn Medal.
Not right now.
In Woodson's hands, ASALH exemplified history's power as a transformative weapon. And through his search for truth, Carter G. Woodson built the arsenal of scholarship that was ultimately able to destroy the lie. My father used to say this. He worked with Woodson. He used to always say to us, we work to disprove the lie that the Negro has no history or none worthy of respect. And that was the lie Woodson did disprove through the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Woodson gave us a truer understanding, not only of ourselves as a people, Black people, but also a truer understanding of the United States by showing us that African Americans had contributed mightily to this nation. Historians in the pages of the Journal of African American History, then called the Journal of Negro History, had revealed African Americans' role in the American Revolution, the Civil War, in fact, all of America's wars. They had written about the experience and contributions of free Blacks in the pre-Civil War era. They gave voice to the enslaved. They told of the abolitionist movement through the publications of ASALH's and Woodson's associated publishers. Scholars, white and Black, examined the social and political context of Reconstruction. And I say white and Black because even if you were a white scholar, if you were writing about Black people, there was no journal for you to publish in, at least no historical journal. So the great historian, Carter G. Woodson, was recognized as the founder, not only of this movement, but as the person who jump-started the civil rights, the scholarship during the civil rights era of the 1960s. He is the one who really made it possible for these new interpretations. When I came along in school, we weren't reading Ulrich Phillips anymore. Well, it was Woodson who helped launch that new scholarship. Historians call this revisionist, or new correctives of interpretation. But also in the 1960s and 1970s, by the sheer quantity of publications by and about African Americans, were being published as journals and books and magazines and newspapers, and we live with that reality today. Thus, Woodson's and ASALH's belief that that African American history had a role to play in changing the racial status quo made it not parallel to the civil rights movement, but absolutely integral to that movement. Dr. Woodson also revealed that we can learn and be transformed by Black history in many different types of venues. So not only in libraries, not only in schoolrooms, but through the celebration of Black History Month. In Woodson's lifetime, Negro History Week. He gave us the opportunity to experience transformative knowledge at lectures, forums, conferences. And here I want to put a plug in for the 105th annual conference that will be held in Alabama, Montgomery, Alabama, in the fall. The civil rights lawyer and later judge, Raymond Pace Alexander, was one of the founders of ASALH's Philadelphia branch in the 1920s. And Judge Alexander talks about himself at 15 years old, having first heard Carter G. Woodson. He said he heard him at a forum at his church. And Judge Alexander often expressed that hearing Woodson completely changed his life because he was thinking about dropping out of school. And when Woodson talked to him about historical facts that were not in his history books, Raymond Pace Alexander decided he would stay in school and try to learn more. No wonder the Black sociologist who in the 1920s edited the National Urban League, the Opportunity magazine, a man named Charles S. Johnson, would say that the Journal of Negro History provided sources of new pride and self-respect for Negro youth. And I can identify with this because I remember my first presentation on a panel at an ASALH conference, and this was in 1975 in Atlanta. And I was a graduate student on the ASALH program, and it was at that meeting where I first saw Constance Baker Motley. And Constance Baker Motley at the time was a federal judge, and she sat on the district court in New York, and she gave the keynote at the opening meeting. And I was a budding Black women's historian. And at that time, in the 70s, Black women's history was just a dream. It was just an initial kind of thought. People were writing dissertations like Rosalind Turbo Penn, but none of us knew much about it. Seeing and hearing Constance Baker Motley gave me a sense of personal affirmation. First of all, as a federal judge, she represented history in the making. But her civil rights activism, she is the lawyer who won the battle to get James Meredith into Ole Miss, the University of Mississippi. And her story told me, just looking at her, that African American women's history was waiting to be told. She said so many profound things, and her speech is in the Journal of Negro History. But one of the things she said about the United States, she said, Black and white activists have struggled through the years, and we are still struggling. We are now a multiracial, multicultural, multi-ethnic body politic struggling to make democracy work. And her words are as true today as they were over 40 years ago. We are still trying to make democracy work. But Dr. Woodson made it possible for us to be inspired, to keep fighting to make democracy work. And one of the ways he did it was through the branches. In 1938, the Negro History Bulletin, which was edited by, Carter Woodson was the editor. In 1938, the Bulletin described the founding of the Detroit branch. And this was how you were described. Rarely has a branch of the organization been launched under such favorable auspices. And years later, in 1962, and my father, at that time, is the editor of the Negro History Bulletin. And in 1962, there is an article called Summary History of the Detroit branch of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. And I want to read to you what the author of that article says. Through its efforts in the period from 1935 to 1955, the association introduced the study of the Negro to a great degree, to some degree into the public schools, but to a great degree in the churches. and also in clubs throughout the metropolitan area. And I'm quoting, "Thousands of scholarly and authentic books and periodicals on Negro history were sold to the city's black residents and also to whites in southeast Michigan." And then this summary history stated, "Undoubtedly, the Detroit branch did much to instill knowledge of and pride in the part the Negro has played in the minds and hearts of people, thus making a contribution to better interracial understanding." Now, one of the founders of the Detroit branch was a woman named Mrs. Sylvia M. Tucker. And during the mid-1930s, she was described in that article as a dynamic leader. She was known as, quote, Miss Negro History. She is credited for promoting Negro history in all sections of the city, and over the years, the Detroit branch became one of the largest, most respected branches in the national organization. The national conference was held here in 1943 and in 1952. In fact, in 1952, the national meetings were held in the Detroit Historical Museum and also at Wayne State University. In October 1962, the Negro History Bulletin was guest published. So even though my father was the editor overall, it was a special guest issue. And the editor was a man named Broadus N. Butler. Now, Broadus Butler would go on to renown as an educator. He becomes president of the University of the District of Columbia. But at the time, he served as in 1962, as the chair of the research committee of the Detroit branch. And in that special issue, Harvey C. Jackson Jr., he's the one who wrote it, wrote the article that I mentioned, Summary History. And this is what he says. He mentions his own father, Harvey C. Jackson Sr. of Inkster, Michigan. And his father was very active with the association, so Inkster had a branch. The two branches merged in 1940, Inkster and Detroit, to what you have today. And so Harvey Jackson Sr. was the president of this new combined branch, and Sylvia Tucker was secretary. I'm going to quote Harvey Jackson Jr., his summary history. "With Mr. Jackson as president and Mrs. Tucker as secretary, and with the aid of a strong core of interested citizens, the Detroit branch reached its high point in the 1940s. Scores of Negro history study groups sprang up throughout the city." He talks about huge mass meetings held by the branch, which scholars came from throughout the country during every day of Black History Week. So Detroit, you have a proud history as a branch. Now, reading the article, I couldn't help but recognize that the ASALH Detroit branch felt a special joy every time Dr. Woodson came to speak. And the branch did invite other scholars, as I've said. But in 1962, they were really doing interesting things. And I think Charles Farrell mentioned this about Africa. They were really interested in Africa. In 1960 alone, 17 nations had gained independence in Africa. And so they were interested in Africa, not only in it politically, but also its art. And one of the presidents of the branch, a man named Arthur Core, I don't know if I'm saying his name right.
That's all right, you got it.
Okay, he was president of the branch during that time period. And he was very active with the arts and bringing the branch to people who worked in issues of Africa. And among the most notable examples of how widespread, according to Harvey Jackson, was the Garfield Junior High School. Do you still have that here? The Garfield Junior High, and the principal at the time was a man named Charles Daly. So in the summary history, we learned that the branch continued to do great things. So in 1962, the work of its research committee, chaired by Dr. Broadus N. Butler, and in 1962, it was in its second year of existence, this committee, it made, and I quote, strides in its work of studying, writing, and delivering scholarly papers on some aspect of Black history, preparing a bibliography of sources, and serving overall as a resource for those interested in the city in the issues of African Americans. Now, Carter G. Woodson once observed that those who have no records of what their forebears have accomplished lose the inspiration that comes from the teaching of biography and history. And Woodson realized that we are able to see and to know history's power, not only to transform, but to inspire us. And I think this is what the Detroit branch represented. It represented a story of inspiration. Woodson also realized that we are able to see and to know history's power to inspire when we are introduced to historical figures, when we discover the stories of persons and groups who made significant contributions in the past. They could be Black scholars, or scientists, or inventors, teachers, reformers, freedom fighters, entrepreneurs, and branch members. Great lives are inspirational. The story of Sylvia Tucker, for one, is inspiring. Did you know that shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, there was a call to war, and so people needed to give blood because the Red Cross needed to make sure that there would be blood for wounded soldiers. So she immediately goes to the Red Cross Donor Center in Detroit to give her blood, but she was turned away. Right. The supervisor at the donor center informed her that the Red Cross did not allow Black people as blood donors. And I think sometimes we forget just how pervasive racism was at just basic levels. But in the early 1940s, Blacks and whites were portrayed by science as having different blood. And it would take the Black scientist, Charles Drew, who would soon prove this idea wrong. But in the meantime, Sylvia Tucker of the Detroit branch wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt, wife of the president. She expressed her shock, her grief, her humiliation in a powerful letter of protest. And now Sylvia Tucker is written about in history books. Right. And this history has given us new heroes, men and women like her, who navigated the difficulties of life, and yet they still kept fighting, and they still kept persevering. The 1962 historical summary of the Detroit branch concluded, and I'm going to read to you what Harvey Jackson Jr. says at the very end. He says, "Every institution is the lengthened shadow of a great man." And of course, we would add today a great woman as well. And the author, Harvey, goes on to say, "Certainly the personality of Carter G. Woodson is felt through the years in Detroit, through the work of the association he founded and to which he gave his life." And I think we are here today to bear witness of that. In 1937, Carter G. Woodson, this is around the same time when your Detroit branch is in its formative years. In 1937, Carter G. Woodson observed that African Americans were increasingly striving to learn about the lives of historical figures at sites where the deeds and events of history actually took place. And he spoke of the many Black people and others who visited those sites. And he spoke of them, he says they went to the ground on which they, meaning Black foreparents, labored for humanity. And then Woodson went on to say that many African Americans of his day in the 1930s visited in tour groups, and they took what they call pilgrimages to places such as the Frederick Douglass Home or the home of Paul Laurence Dunbar, the Sojourner Truth House. And he stated that in visiting those places, that very act enshrined in our hearts these heroes. And I want to emphasize that in that time, none of these places were recognized by the National Park Service. So we only come to know these places, if you were living in the 1930s, because of Carter G. Woodson and ASALH. And his use of the word enshrine touches me. It touches me because what he was ultimately saying was that the heroes and the places of history were restored to visibility because of the Black History Movement. And more than this, Woodson's message for us today is that we must continue to discover and restore to history those black men and women still obscured and omitted from the history books. Those figures, in fact, Charles Wright, for whom this museum is named, talked about the forgotten champions of history. And that's what these people, like Sylvia talked about, they are the forgotten champions of history. And so we actually stand in those places and sometimes do not even know the history of those places. In fact, sometimes you see names on streets and we don't even realize that the names are our own people and they're there because of the struggle for social justice. In fact, I think of Charles Wright. I wonder if a lot of our young people even understand who Charles Wright is, whose name graces this museum. Because Woodson died in 1950, he never lived to see the significant social transformation in America, brought on by the movements for civil rights and black pride. He did not live long enough to know that the Supreme Court would rule in the Brown decision that separate was inherently unequal. He never lived to see Jim Crow laws struck down. He never knew that his Negro History Week would become Black History Month, or that universities and museums and Black Studies departments would teach courses on African American history, or that I'd be teaching in the department and now chairing the department from which he got his Ph.D. In fact, in all humility, if you think about it, I was hired, and I'm sure Para was hired, to teach African American history. The only reason that opportunity was given to me was because of the pioneering work of Carter G. Woodson. I hope that this opportunity may be made available to others because we continue that legacy. So I'd like to leave you with this. How many of you have gone to Washington, D.C. to see the National Museum of African American History? How many of you plan to go back? When you go back, make time for the Carter G. Woodson National Historic Site. The renovation is not quite complete, but a lot has been done, and tours are available now. Take your children and your students, your friends and your colleagues, because in that space, 1538 9th Street Northwest, where he lived and worked, where he published and did all that we understand ASALH to do. In that space, you will understand more deeply, and each time you go, you will realize more clearly why this great scholar will be forever enshrined in our hearts. Thank you.
Some of what Dr. Higginbotham had talked about dovetails with some images that I put in a PowerPoint presentation, so this works out just perfect. The spirit of Carter G. Woodson is in Detroit in some serious manners. These are some excerpts from the Negro History Bulletin from back in the day about Harvey C. Jackson Jr., who led the organization in Detroit for 25 years. And it goes back to talk about some of the meetings that were in Detroit sponsored by the association. Here's some long text that you don't need to read. I'll send the documents to the branch and you can distribute it. But this is actually the article that Dr. Higginbotham was referencing in terms of the Detroit branch's activities. Here is a picture of the association meeting when it was held in Detroit in the 1940s with Sylvia Tucker blown up and on the corner. Here is an image of scholars gathering in Detroit in 1964 at the Detroit Urban League Guild, and a description of this conference that took place in the 60s as well. Here's another image of Negro History Week celebrations that took place in Detroit going back to the 1930s. So we all know about the deep history of African American history in the Detroit area. This is some more evidence of that. Carter G. Woodson spoke in Detroit upon many occasions. As reported by the Baltimore Afro-American, Woodson delivered a passionate lecture to more than 3,000 black Detroiters in the YMCA gymnasium. He also spoke in Detroit upon several other occasions during the 1930s. And I should mention that the first National Association for the Study of Negro Life and History Conference in Detroit was held in 1943, and that many of the activities were held in the Detroit Public Library. Since 1943, the conference has been held in Detroit upon several different occasions. Though I've been studying the father of black history, his life and work for more than 20 years, and I'm clicking the PowerPoint thing and it's not working, so, okay. Whatever, this is why you don't use technology. If anyone in the booth can just run the PowerPoint slides while I talk, everything is good, but I'm gonna keep going. I've been studying Carter G. Woodson for more than 20 years, and I still marvel at his achievements, humility, and work ethic and commitment to the African American freedom struggle. As he wrote in the Pittsburgh Courier in 1933, quote, "With the exception of $12 to $15 a week, which I spend on myself, and a smaller amount I give to a widowed sister, I turn back into the work all the money which I can obtain. The only need that I have for money is to relieve the stress of others," end quote. Woodson literally gave his life to the cause of legitimizing and popularizing black history. He called this a life and death struggle. As one of his mentees and understudies by the name of Charles S. Wesley remarked, quote, "We do not have to ask for the fictionist, the poet, and the builders of dreams to create his greatness. Woodson has been a builder of his own monument," end quote. There are many adjectives that we could use, perhaps contradictory ones, to describe Carter Woodson. And I have a whole bunch of them, and let me just lay some of them out in alphabetical order for you. Afrocentric, ambitious, cantankerous, collaborative, committed, driven, family-oriented, focused, frugal, generous, hardworking, humble, humorous, independent, outspoken, passionate, radical, respectable, serious, stubborn, and working class to the core. His accomplishments are embodied in a historic site, as Dr. Higginbotham mentioned. His home that he purchased in 1922 at 1538 9th Street Northwest in Washington, D.C. for $8,000 cash. In 1976, perfect timing here. There you go, there's the home. In 1976, the Woodson home was designated a National Historic Landmark, and on December 19, 2003, the National Park Service acquired the home in order to incorporate it as a National Historic Site. On February 27th, 2006, the building was officially dedicated as the Carter G. Woodson Home, National Historic Site, 389th unit of the National Park Service. From 1922 until 1950, this historic space where Woodson lived on the 3rd floor, that building right there, served as the headquarters of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History and is the epicenter of the operations for the early Black history movement. The Woodson home, which is currently being refurbished, as Dr. Higginbotham said, will tell the story of Woodson's life. And Woodson's life was truly an extraordinary one for the ages. He was born on this day in 1875 in Virginia. He grew up in what could be described as poverty on his father's farm. He worked a range of manual labor jobs, including being a coal miner. As a child, because he had to work for the household to get by, he only attended school for 5 months out of every year. He once remarked that he grasped the foundations of reading and writing in his late teens. And in 1920, he told his friend Jesse Moreland, quote, "You should know enough about me to understand that I'm the most independently hungry man in the United States. I once drove a garbage wagon in my hometown. toiled for 6 years as a coal miner and often saw the day when my mother had her breakfast and did not know where she would find her dinner, end quote. During his lifetime, Woodson wore many hats. He worked as a teacher, he joined civil rights organizations, he worked under the auspices of the U.S. War Department, he was an outspoken journalist who wrote countless newspaper columns. He was a black public intellectual before the invention of this term.
That's right.
He traveled around the world. And of course, he laid the foundations for the scientific study and popularization of what we now today call Black history. He mastered the art of balancing being a rigorous scholar with being a public practitioner and grassroots activist. At age 37 in 1912, he earned a Ph.D. from Harvard. He became the second African American to earn a Ph.D. in history. Obviously, the first was W.B. Du Bois, and the first and only to earn a Ph.D. in history with parents who were former slaves. As was said, he founded the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, which was called the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. He founded the Journal of Negro History, which I am humbled and blessed to be editing. He founded the Associated Publishers Incorporated. This guy was prolific. He produced more than 20 books, including his famous 1922 book called The Negro in Our History, and of course we can never forget The Miseducation of the Negro. He was the driving force behind the early Black history movement. He was a leading Black scholar activist during the era of Jim Crow segregation. He died suddenly in his office home in April of 1950, and folks say he had a heart attack. He worked himself very, very hard. He was called the father of Black history for a reason. He was an institutional builder for Black history. He thought if he didn't do his work, that Black people would become ideologically exterminated. He routinely worked 18 hours a day. He gave his life for the cause. It's well known that he was a top-notch scholar. He laid these foundations, but some people don't recognize what he did to democratize the study of Black history. And I think this needs to be stressed, because it wasn't just about being a scholar. It was about being committed to the cause and given to people to the day that he died. People don't recognize that stuff. And that's the type of leaders that people might want to aspire to in these type of times. He was a personal resource, you know. He lectured across the nation in rural districts. He didn't charge a whole bunch of money. Sometimes these public intellectuals be charging 10, 15, 20, 30, $50,000 to give a talk. They need to get in the air-conditioned limousine, get driven to and from where they're going, first-class accoutrements. Now, I'm not saying Woodson didn't deserve stuff like that, but he didn't do that. He wanted the people to get the information. You could write him and he would send you materials for free. He sent out people in the community to educate people. He set up branches and clubs. His book, The Negro in Our History, had sold more than 40,000 copies by the early 1940s, and it was being adopted by schools across the nation where African Americans were going to school and couldn't learn about Black people. You could take classes through Woodson and the association through something called the Home Study Program, where you could take classes from leading Black scholars who would grade your stuff and comment on it, through the mail, of course, not online like it is today. As Dr. Higginbotham said, he opened up the doors to many different people. I don't know if y'all know this, but unlike most scholarly organizations, membership in the association is not really based upon one's so-called educational status. It's open to the community, and it's always been. Amongst the most active members historically have been school teachers, and oftentimes Black women school teachers. The meetings during Woodson's lifetime were always held, as Dr. Higginbotham had mentioned, in the Black community, in churches, in high schools, in colleges, in universities, in community centers. The Negro History Bulletin that was mentioned was an important thing that Carter Woodson did to popularize the cause. The Negro History Bulletin was a popular Black history magazine. He founded it in 1937 in October. And throughout the 40s and 50s, it was very cheap. You could buy it for like 12 to 15 cents a copy. In fact, you could get a prescription for it, you know, for the whole year for like $1 that included 9 issues. And he sold it at a loss For each subscription they sold for $1, it cost $2 to produce. Now, economically, that doesn't make sense. But he wasn't in it for the financial profit from his people. He wanted to get the message across. He was doing this to educate people because he actually believed that if we changed our mind and our thought about who we are and where we come from, that it would change our actions and behaviors. He underscored that in the Miseducation of the Negro. He says that over and over again. He published for children as well. Woodson loved the children. It's kind of funny. People say he was really cantankerous, and I think he was. I've read enough personal documents about his life and how he treated certain people that I might not want to share with other people because I like him so much. But he could be cantankerous. But he loved the kids. He'd hang out with the children all day. He was like a celebrity with the kids. And so he had children's pages in the Negro History Bulletin for kids. And of course, he created Negro History Week, which we know laid the foundations for what we now call National African American History Month or Black History Month. And I just want to say a few things about what he dealt with Negro History Week, because sometimes people get it a little bit twisted. It was multifold, his purpose of Negro History Week. The real first reason why he wanted to do it is he wanted to integrate the study of black people into secondary schools, elementary schools and high schools. And here's a perfect example of a Negro History Week celebration in an elementary school where teachers would educate the youth about black history. I got 3 kids who are all in college now, and when they were going to elementary school, we had to go in and educate the teachers because they weren't even teaching it right to them even during the month of February. So back in the day, you know that it was much different and much worse. So he wanted to use Negro History Week to make black teachers and teachers in schools emphasize black people during that week with the intention of this becoming a year-long celebration. This is what he said about it. He said, quote, this is Woodson speaking, quote, Negro History Week should be a demonstration of the past of the Negro and what is to be accomplished. A subject that receives attention 1 week out of 36 in school will not mean much to anyone, end quote. He wanted Negro History Week to be Negro History Year, okay? He wasn't doing this for the tokenism business. He was doing it to get African American stuff really integrated into the teaching. He also thought it could instill pride in black people. He also thought that Negro History Week could educate white Americans and make them recognize that black people came from glorious civilizations in a past that had accomplished so much and contributed so much to American democracy. Associated Publishers is something that Dr. Higginbotham mentioned, and I just want to touch upon it. It's the publishing house that Carter G. Woodson created. It was the first major black publishing house. He created it in 1921, and it operated out of the house, the picture of the house that we showed you, a publishing house. Dozens of books were published by it because the leading presses in white America at the time would not publish stuff about black people unless it was negative and could be used to support the oppression of black people during the period of Jim Crow segregation. So he opened up a publishing house. A publishing house that will publish works by progressive white scholars, but majority by black scholars and by black grassroots scholars, i.e. scholars who didn't necessarily have to have a Ph.D., including school teachers. And a lot of times these books would be used during Negro History Week. This was a very practical function. And this is what Carter Woodson said about Associated Publishers Incorporated. Quote, we have no desire to make money. We seek merely to serve humanity, end quote. He was a community man. He was a generous person. His residence was used as a meeting place, and here he is with the kids, hanging out. His residence was used as a meeting place, an informal intellectual movement center, a warehouse for books. Here he is being mobbed by the youth. Imagine this, an old Woodson, hanging out with young people. They're like mobbing him. Look at the sister in the back, trying to get autographs and stuff. He was a celebrity. He was a celebrity, a humble celebrity. He used his house to invite people to hang out. He wanted people to get the information. But he also had some other stuff to him too. I want to share from you a handful of quotes and then I'll wrap it up. People have some stories about Woodson, and when I was doing the historic resource study for the Carter G. Woodson home, and Dr. Higginbotham was involved in this as well, we were able to conduct interviews with people who worked with Woodson or who knew Woodson in different ways, whether it was through their parents or relatives. And people tell a lot of different stories about him, and these are really nice to hear. So I want to read some reminiscence from some different people. This is Mary Pearl Daughtry, who worked as a typist and secretary for Woodson from the fall of 1938 till the summer of 1941. And this is what she said in 2000 at the age of 84. She still remembered hanging out with Carter G. Woodson. Quote, this is what she said, quote, "He would walk around his office, his eyes closed and his hands clasped behind his back, crisply dictating. Sometimes he would dictate whole chapters of one of his books without any reference notes. Then I'd show him the manuscript and he would say, 'Mrs. D, you split an infinitive,' end quote." He also ran his office with somewhat of authority. He was a strict disciplinarian. Again, because he believed that it was vital to record and document the history of black people. And so if you weren't rolling with him with that type of seriousness, you weren't going to be working with him for that long. And I'm not saying that Langston Hughes wasn't serious, but Langston Hughes quit, you know? He was like, "I ain't doing this." I think Woodson told him like to catalog a whole bunch of stuff on free black people in Cincinnati, and it was all handwritten, and he told him he had a couple hours to do it, and he was like, nah, I ain't doing this. For this paycheck? Are you kidding me? I'm gonna go write some poetry and win some awards. You know? He was a serious guy. So one of his employees said that, quote, "We used to say at the office, when Woodson spoke, no dog barked," end quote. He was trying to get busy, that's right. There's very few existing descriptions of the home that is being refurbished in DC that you should all go check out. But we do have a few, and I want to read for you a few of them. One is from longtime librarian and scholar and archivist and historian L.D. Reddick, who in 1953, he was a mover and shaker in the association, said the following about Woodson and his home. Quote, this is L.D. Reddick speaking, quote, "I found myself at 1538 9th Street Northwest. This was the headquarters of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. The first floor was given over to the mail order work of the association. Woodson's office was on the second floor, and what an office. Books and magazines were piled everywhere, almost as bad as my office these days. Papers and letters and galley proofs covered the desk, but there seemed to be actually no disorder. The editor, Woodson, probably did more high-grade work at that desk than any editor that I know. Woodson lived, that is, slept, on the third floor of the small building," end quote. Woodson was humble, and a lot of this has to do with his upbringing. He used to always tell people that he was a coal miner and that I can do anything. And I think that he took that hard work ethic, manual labor mentality to his work as an academic, and I don't think that ever totally left him. He was not afraid to do the work himself. And I think, in many cases, the true measure of a leader is someone who doesn't ask people to do stuff, no matter how so-called menial it is, that person who's a so-called leader won't do him or herself, right? Woodson used to walk all the time around DC. You know, when it was time to ship out books, he didn't tell an assistant to go take the books and walk in the rain and snow. He walked by himself. And we got his shoes too. I don't know if y'all know this, you probably don't, but we got a pair of his shoes. And I'm sure the heels are really worn down. We got a pair of the shoes that we're gonna put in the house. He was a hard worker. And there was a guy by the name of Lorenzo Johnston Green who worked with Carter G. Woodson back in the day. Lorenzo Johnston Green was a longtime history professor at Lincoln University in Jefferson City, Missouri. He was also known as being like Mr. Black History in the state of Missouri. And Lorenzo Johnston Green said the following about Carter Woodson, which tells you about his personality. This is what Lorenzo Green said, quote, "Woodson was no snob. No work was too menial for him. Since Woodson could not afford to hire a janitor, not infrequently of a morning I encountered him attired in pajamas and a shabby bathrobe, broom and dustpan or mop and pail in hand, cleaning the office. The climax came one morning when I found him down on his hands and knees oiling the floors, and of all things, the floor of my office that adjoined his. Ashamed and embarrassed at seeing him do such lowly work, I volunteered to help, but he cut me short with, quote, Mr. Green, I didn't hire you to be a janitor, end quote. I want to close now with just a few passages pertaining to Carter G. Woodson, and two of them are from him, and then one of them is from Mary McLeod Bethune. So I want to usher in the spirit of Woodson here on his birthday with his own words. This is Carter Woodson in the Norfolk Journal and Guide in 1933. This is what he wrote. Quote, in the work of the association, an employee is supposed to catch the spirit of the organization and give his or her time and labor for mere pittance. At present, I'm paying an employee on my staff twice as much as I receive because he has more dependents than I have. Although he has been offered elsewhere more than he receives from the association, he remains with us. Several persons have said to me that you are doing your work at too great a sacrifice, for the public should do more to support it. Yet I do not think that any of our workers feel that they should be praised for what they have done. These sacrifices have been willingly made. These workers who make such sacrifices for the good of others are doing what all Negroes in the service of their people must learn to do if the race is to be extricated from its present predicament, end quote. The second quote is also from Woodson that comes from the 1930s. And this reads as follows, quote, the servant of the people, unlike the leader, is not on a high horse, elevated above the people and trying to carry them to some designated point to which he would like to go for his own advantage. The servant of the people is down among them, living as they live, doing what they do, and enjoying what they enjoy. And I'm gonna wrap it up with Sister Mary McLeod Bethune. And if you don't know who Mary McLeod Bethune is, you should at least know that she's a major civil rights activist, a major educator, a major political and public leader, a major leader of black women's movements, and she served as president of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History from 1936 to 1951, and she was a very close friend of Carter G. Woodson. In fact, it's said that only two people called Woodson by his first name, and that was Nanny Helen Burroughs, supposedly, and Mary McLeod Bethune. Mary McLeod Bethune had the following to say about Carter G. Woodson. Quote, he was a man of the soil. He grew to young manhood the hard, self-taught way, but he was too big and too wise to underestimate or reject the tools of intellectual training and skill. He knew the value of both experience and training. He had both and applied both ceaselessly and unstintingly to his labors for his fellow men. He scorned nothing that could be used to build a better civilization. Long ago, he learned to clean bricks, to rehabilitate our cultures, and to strengthen our democracies. Thank you very, very much this evening for your attention. And once again, we must give honorable thanks and praises to our torchbearer, Dr. Carter G. Woodson. Thank you.
Well, my father, in fact, one of the slides at the very beginning about the Detroit branch, it had Albert N.D. Brooks. That was my father. And he took me to the association. He was a secondary school principal. And his school, Garnet Patterson, was very close to, in physical distance, to the association. And my father probably got involved with the association in the 1930s. My grandfather was also a Baptist minister who was close to Carter Woodson, and in fact, in one of the very early journals, my grandfather has articles about the Baptists in Savannah, Georgia, or something like that. So my father would take me down there on Saturdays. My father was a person who was so committed to this cause that after he would work his 9-to-5 job, he would go and work at the association. After Woodson died, my father became secretary-treasurer of the organization. And so I never knew Woodson. And I don't have memories so much of my father talking about the house as much as I saw the goings on of the house, which I just presumed were the same when Woodson was there. He had two secretaries at that time, a woman named Mrs. Milton and Mrs. Miles. And they typed and they worked. And my father was, in my vision of what he did, I can see him so clearly putting the Bulletin together, because my father was the editor of the Negro History Bulletin. So as a child, it was really moving to me to see the things that the Bulletin did. I've just written an article about photographs and what photographs have meant for historians. But one of the things that I said is that when I would go to the association, and you saw those images that Harold just showed and the covers, and I could see the image of a Benjamin Mays, for example, who was the president of Morehouse, and I could see an image of Kwame Nkrumah, who had just become the Prime Minister of Ghana in 1957, and they're telling me stories. You know, I saw photographs of black soldiers. Those images were my favorites. You know, for me, they were the authenticators. If anybody said, well, you really didn't have history, I could always point to those images and say, they are the history. So that was really important for me. And it was also important for me, I mean, it shaped my life. He never took me to third floors. I don't know what was going on at the third floor. I was basically at that first floor level. But it was always everybody working. You know, everybody was working. I think I have the same culture in my life. You know, when people come to visit, and I have friends who are writing, and we just all sit at the dining room table and we work, you know, and I get this, I'm sure, from this sense of mission. You always got this sense that they were working hard, nobody was getting paid much. I don't think my father was getting paid at all. But the idea that they recognized something was bigger than them. So I'll just end with this, that from childhood, when people always say, did you know you wanted to be a history professor? I always knew I wanted to be a teacher. I didn't grow up thinking I'd be a history professor, but I always knew I wanted to be a history teacher. So my first job was a junior high school teacher. I was a junior high school teacher, I was a high school teacher, I was a college teacher. So I always knew that that was my mission in life because of Carter G. Woodson and the environment that he created.
Very good. And also, could you just give us an idea of why he was so committed and how things have changed from the time when the association met in Detroit and other places and perhaps had 100 or so many people attending to what it has become under the leadership of Dr. Evelyn Higginbotham and the journal editorship of Dr. Pero Dagbovie.
Thanks for the question, multifaceted question. Hopefully I can remember everything you asked, but I'll give it a shot. I'm a biographer in many ways. I like to write biography, and biography to me is fascinating because by studying the lives of people, whether they're famous or ordinary people, we can also study the times that they existed in and the times that inevitably molded them. And I think, like all of us, Carter Woodson was distinctly molded by the times during which he lived and came of age. And I think that has a lot to do with his personality and in particular his work ethic. not many young people today can relate to having to, because of child labor laws, work as kids for the family to help sustain the household and not go to school. These are things that he had to do when he was a young man. And so he learned some grit, determination. It's unfortunate that he did not write an autobiography, but there's several articles that he's written where we can piece together parts of his life. And I remember reading one piece that he wrote in one of the newspaper columns, it might have been the Pittsburgh Courier, where he was talking about, the family going hungry often and having to eat dandelions and other stuff and not have enough food to last. That builds a sense of struggle, inevitably. So I think that his personality, his work ethic was molded by that. Where he got the idea to commit himself to Black history, we probably would have a hard time identifying that, but some people say it was learned at Harvard. Some people say that when he was at Harvard, that one of his professors, Channing, said that Black people have no history. And Woodson rose his hand and said, oh, yeah, they do. And he said, well, if they do, prove me wrong. So he made it part of his commitment there to do that. And I think that he could have done many different things with his Ph.D., but he decided to use his Ph.D. to help legitimize making the study of Black history visible within academic spaces. He recognized, I think, that with getting a Ph.D. from Harvard, which was considered the bastion of intellectualism at the time, that he could apply that to the Black experience and it couldn't be refuted. And that's why he believed in this kind of scientific method of studying the past. And I'll just close, I think, by addressing one of your questions that was talking about change. I think there's been a lot of change in the Black historical profession since the so-called days of Woodson that are in large part based upon, the so-called gains since the Civil Rights Movement. One thing that happened was the massive brain drain from many of the HBCUs. During the days of Woodson, during the period of Jim Crow segregation, all the leading Black scholars were teaching at HBCUs. If you were taking courses in the history department at Howard, North Carolina Central, Lincoln, Southern,
Fisk University.
Fisk, you were taking, I know there's about 80 plus that I could list, Monroe work at Tuskegee, there was places that you would get a whole bunch of information. After, integration comes and the predominantly white colleges start hiring folks, they start taking people and offering different things. I think part of the level of commitment to the collective began to transform. And so I think that part of why we don't have more Woodsons nowadays has to do with the times and the increasing belief in being self-centered and careerist in many ways. That's just my point.
It's interesting, though, that Woodson never went to a historically Black school. So his undergraduate was at Berea College. And that's a great story because he is the last integrated class. The state of Kentucky ends integration of education. You have to live, you can't be a Black student being taught and a white student being taught within 25 miles of each other. And so when they closed it down, Berea took that case all the way to the Supreme Court, but they lost it. But when Woodson went to Berea, then he went to the University of Chicago for his master's degree, and then he went to Harvard. So I'm not sure that simply going to a white school, he did it, and he was as passionate as ever. So I think he is complicated in that way, though.
Okay, well, all of these are very good comments, and it's been suggested that we see if any people in the audience have any questions or comments that they would like to make, especially questions that the two speakers